3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability, uniquely,
without a heritage, every generation starts over.
Ask not
to remind the current regime
what your country...
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
All action.
to get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
The very first commercial power station in the United States began its life in September of 1882. Operated by the Edison Illuminating Company under the direction of American inventor Thomas Edison, the coal-burning plant generated enough electricity to power just 400 light bulbs, owned by a total of 82 clients. And all of those clients lived within a half a mile because that's the furthest the electricity could be transmitted. That was one reason the Pearl Street Station, as it was known, was located not in some far-flung suburban business park, but in the heart of New York City's financial district. The other reason was publicity. Edison needed to demonstrate the viability of the electrical empire that he was building. And in that, he was successful. Americans, who comprise about 4% of the population of the world, now consume 16% of the world's electricity. Now, with the push for green energy, governments around the world have pushed for and passed subsidies for so-called renewable energy sources like wind and solar. The United States passed large subsidies of this kind under the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act, passed in 2022. But these policies do not have the effect of creating long-term stability in the American energy grid. Here to explain why is Mario Loyola, Senior Fellow in Law, Economics, and Technology, here at the Heritage Foundation. Mario, welcome back to Heritage Explains.
Thank you.
So here at the Heritage Foundation, you study energy, and you've been talking for a long time about electrical energy and its availability in the United States, but you predict problems. Can you talk about that?
We are already seeing problems. We have been seeing problems for several years. Electricity prices for most Americans have gone up by 30% since the beginning of the Biden administration. And of course, just a month into the Biden administration in 2021, we had Winter Storm Uri, in which the Texas power grid basically failed. And 200 people may have died because of the failure of the power grid in Texas. Those problems are not going away. They're not going away. They're getting worse. And the reason for that is that we have, several obstacles to the ability of the electrical generating capacity of our power plants, of our electricity grid to grow. Our ability to add new plants, to build new plants. And it's increasingly clear, and by the way, this is a very serious problem because with artificial intelligence and the AI revolution, and people may not know, but a Google search that's assisted by AI requires 100 times more electricity than a normal Google search. So the AI revolution, it requires an enormous amount of electricity. Between that and all the Teslas that people are driving and a lot of the other electrification of policies that we have, people's houses, appliances, we are looking at a huge expansion in demand, huge increase in demand for electricity over the next 5-10 years. And unfortunately, nobody even has a theory of how the electricity grid can expand quickly enough to meet the new demand. And what does it mean when you have soaring demand and limited supply? That's a scarcity crisis in which prices are going to go up. And the biggest problem that we've identified is the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, the fraudulently named Inflation Reduction Act, I would say, has tax credits for solar and wind that are truly exorbitant. Hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe $1 trillion or more. We don't even know because we don't know when these things are going to expire. And these are tax credits that solar and wind developers can start to cash in on as soon as they start to build these solar and wind plants. And so these things have been around for a while, but the Inflation Reduction Act really took them to the next level. And what we've seen is this tsunami of new solar and wind projects getting dumped on the grid. And the problem with these power plants is that you can't predict when they're going to be available. But when they are available, the utilities have to buy electricity from them. And that means that the coal plants and nuclear plants and natural gas plants on which the grid actually relies have to go idle during the middle of the day when the solar plants are dumping all this free electricity on the grid. And when they have to go idle, they can't recoup their operating costs. And so investors look at that and they say, well, with all this subsidized solar, with all this free, government pay, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Of course, it's the government's paying for it. Your tax dollars are paying for it. But with all this sort of, federally funded solar and wind getting dumped on the grid in the middle of the day, investors look at that and say, well, I'm not going to invest in a new natural gas plant. I'm not going to invest in a new coal plant or a new nuclear plant because I won't be able to recoup my costs. And so what we're seeing is that this supposedly free solar and wind projects that are getting built around the country are ruining the economics of investing in the power sector, in the power sources that we actually need. And so even though in nominal numbers, what we refer to as, the maximum theoretical capacity of a solar plant, the output of a solar plant, the national grid capacity appears to be expanding on paper. In reality, it's contracting, and that's very dangerous.
Do you see that there is a place for so-called renewable energy sources within the grid? What would an actual healthy incorporation of solar, wind, and other alternative energy sources look like?
Well, yeah, something that's not subsidized by federal tax credits. The environmentalists and proponents of renewable energy like to say that renewable energy is cheaper than fossil energy. Okay, well, if it's cheaper, then let them build it and compete in the marketplace. We're not against solar and wind in principle. What we are against is the federal government stepping in and paying $1 trillion for this massive build out of solar and wind that's not responding to market demand or to what the grid operators need or what the utilities need. It's responding to federal subsidies, right? These federal payouts that we don't even have. I mean, it's Congress doing what Congress is good at, which is borrowing money from our children and grandchildren to spend it on things that Congress can't afford. And here it's, $1 trillion. I mean, this is truly, a staggering sum of money that's getting spent on this stuff. And so we definitely need to, no problem with solar and wind as long as it can compete on price and output with everyone else. The problem is the federal subsidies that are killing investment in the other power sources that we need to operate a reliable grid. So
let's say that we kind of continue this path unheeded. What would a crisis in this dimension look like?
Oh, just the continuation of what we're seeing now, which is prices continue to increase. People who live in Pennsylvania and Ohio are probably going to see their electricity rates. They could see their electricity rates double in the next couple of years. Electricity prices are rising across the country. And at the same time, because much more of the grid's overall capacity is weather-dependent solar and wind, you have a much more unreliable grid. So electricity is getting more expensive and blackouts are going to be more frequent. And blackouts are going to be more frequent during winter storms and summer heat waves when blackouts are the most dangerous, right? Which is when you most need electricity. And so we're going to see very dangerous consequences of this. And I think it's important for the artificial intelligence revolution and America's technological renaissance, American technological dominance, America's manufacturing renaissance, all of these things that we sort of agree as a nation on a bipartisan basis that we want to happen here. These things will not happen here if electricity is too expensive and unreliable. They will happen somewhere else. And there are already countries lining up, like in the Middle East, that are saying, hey, we've got cheap electricity, build your data centers here. China has much cheaper electricity. At the beginning of the Biden, at the end of the first Trump term, our electricity prices in the United States were pretty competitive with those in China. Now it's almost double. Now those electricity rates are almost double what they are in China. And that's a big, big disadvantage for manufacturing, which depends on electricity. And so I think that, unfortunately, what Congress is good at in the progressive in the last 100 years, since the progressive movement and the New Deal turned Congress into a bazaar of special interest groups. What Congress spends all its time doing is catering to the special interests that hire, well-paid lobbyists to come and talk to them. And so right now, there's an army of lobbyists coming in and telling them why all these renewable subsidies are important and why they should be protected and how disruptive it's going to be if they're ended. And this is a situation where Congress really needs to just take a break from catering to special interests and focus instead on the public interest, which is to end the Inflation Reduction Act's tax credits for solar and wind, and free up the nation's electricity grid to expand to meet all the new demand.
Does it look like something is going to happen legislatively in that dimension?
Well, the Trump administration has committed to ending the Green New scam. They understand the problems that these subsidies cause. Unfortunately, these subsidies are very popular among progressives in Congress, and there's even some conservatives. 21 House members. I wrote about this for The Hill a couple of weeks ago. 21 Republican House members wrote a letter to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee warning that, please protect the subsidies. It'll be so disruptive if you take them away. A couple of three or four senators on the Republican side have also, in the Senate, have also indicated that they are against disrupting the flow of federal dollars to the renewable energy projects. I really believe that those senators and their advisors, those congressmen and their advisors, do not fully understand how poisonous the Inflation Reduction Act's tax credits for wind and solar are to the overall electricity grid. Because if they did, they would quickly change their position, and we hope that they will.
You were recently writing about some energy policy changes in Texas that are very interesting. Could you talk about that?
Well, so as I've been saying, the federal tax credits for wind and solar are causing enormous problems for the grid operators in the various states. Grid operators are warning that in the MISO area, which is the upper Midwest and some of the Mississippi Valley down to Louisiana, in the PJM area, which is Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Delaware, they're going to be falling below minimum reserve margins that are the measure of grid adequacy capacity.
So not enough electricity.
Not enough electricity starting this summer. And that means increased risk of blackouts. We had a winter storm where the electricity grid failed in Texas, as I mentioned, back in 2021. And Texas is one of the most energy-rich places in the world. It should have the cheapest electricity in the United States. Texas has added the equivalent of Kuwait and United Arab Emirates to world oil production since 2010, and produces so much natural gas that prices at the pump, at the well where the natural gas comes out, are often negative. And yet electricity prices in Texas are rising. Why is this happening? For the same reasons that we've been describing, because there's been this huge federally subsidized build out of wind and solar in Texas. And now the true costs that those projects impose on the electricity grid and on ratepayers are coming home to roost. And it's causing a crisis for the people that are in charge of managing the electricity grid in Texas. They've come up with a series of bills. For example, Senate Bill 715 by Texas State Senator Kevin Sparks would require solar and wind projects to secure their own backup so that if they're not available when they're needed, they can call on a reliable source like a natural gas plant to provide the backup power, or battery or whatever. But batteries are not getting built quickly enough, so it'll have to be natural gas. And so we hope, this is the Texas legislature is going to adjourn here in another few weeks on June 2nd. It only meets once every 2 years, so it won't come back until 2027. And this is a problem that really needs to get solved right now. And if Texas can figure this out, and Texas is usually in the forefront of how to deal with some of these damaging federal policies, it can really be a model for the nation. What Texas, if SB 715 passes, it'll go a long way to neutralize the toxic impact of the of the Inflation Reduction Act's solar and wind credits. And if other states start to do that, then you're really going to see a drop off in the number of projects that are seeking those credits. And I think we'll be able to restore some rationality and make the power sources that we actually need, nuclear, coal, natural gas, more attractive to investors again.
Mario Loyola, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you to Mario Loyola for his contribution to this episode. You can follow more of Mario's work on energy, regulation, and business at heritage.org. Or you can follow him on X at Mario_A_Loyola. And thanks as always to you for listening to Heritage Explains. You can reach out to us with any thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Heritage Explains is written and produced by Mark Gagne, Lauren Evans, and John Pop.